Hello, so can everyone hear me? Yes, perfect. Thank you. And welcome everyone to our fifth webinar of our series, the series of the International Institute of Shipping and Trade Law, Swansea University, that focuses on the implications of new technologies for the transport industry. Now, aligned with this theme today, we're going to be discussing how law and technology are affecting, transforming the global supply and transport chain. And in a nutshell, what is or what does the digital Tomorrowland of multimodal transport hold? Now, the motivation and the inspiration for the seminar came from research that Dan and I did last year. We were looking into the impact of COVID and the pandemic on air and road transportation of goods. And during our research, we realized that there is a whole ecosystem or technological ecosystem that is now affecting the industry, and it's changing the industry. And part of our research guided us to look past the electronic documents of transport. And we realized that there are certain pioneers in the industry which aim to digitalize the full supply and transport chain. It's not enough for them that we have in certain industries electronic transport documents, but the idea is that we're going to have a digital infrastructure where data related to the goods can be shared almost on real time by all stakeholders in the industry: consignors, consignees, cargo agents, carriers, freight forwarders, customs, airports, and ports. And at the same time, they are working towards providing real live tracking of the conditions of the goods during their transportation from point A to point B. Now, these technological developments seem to us that they are mode neutral. With tweaks, they can apply to all different modes of transport. They increase the transparency of the supply chain and the condition of your goods and how your goods are handled or where they are. And at the same time, take some of the concerns about what mode of transport it is being used from cargo interests. So because they can identify the condition of the goods on real time. Now, this opens several questions. The ones that we're most familiar with in terms of what work we do in the Institute is the liability conventions, and raise questions about the future of the unimodal liability conventions. Do we need to change them? Now, the tendency or the future shows that will be focusing on digital data about goods rather than on documents and what's written on documents. Do we need to change the provisions? Do we need to have provisions on notification of losses, on unlocalized losses? do we need to move a step up and consider essentially the digital future of the industry when we are drafting liability conventions? Or maybe at a future level, at a future time, do we need to reconsider again the need for a multimodal convention, since it seems that the mode of transport you are carrying your goods or you are sending your goods on, it doesn't matter anymore as much as it mattered 20 or 30 years ago. But at the same time, living outside this strict liability regime, we are looking into more fundamental questions that have to do with the management of data. Who owns this data? Does anyone own the data that you are using? Who controls the data? Who processes the data? And this is a question that it's important not only for the transport industry, but has a broader theme, a political theme, a regulatory theme, and a data protection theme. And it seems obvious to us, though, after our research so far, is that data becoming more important and more valuable than the physical goods to which they relate. And it is inevitable that at some point, the regulator will have, or legislation or states will have to deal with this angle and this part of the of commercial data. Now, one additional aspect that hasn't been touched upon during our webinars is that we have now big technological and e-commerce companies moving into the transport sector and moving into the logistics sector. We have Alibaba, we have Amazon, we have Google. And what we're going to discuss today is especially the role of Amazon, that is not only more e-commerce platform that has control over consumer data, but now Amazon offers commercial technological solutions to many industries, including transportation, creates platforms, provides cloud systems, but also is investing into transport itself. It is investing by having its own fleet of aircraft, its own fleet of road transportation, and at some point it starts competing, and it seems that that competition will increase with traditional players in the transport industry, whether they are freight forwarders or whether they are carriers, air carriers, road carriers, and or sea carriers. And that gives a company like Amazon extremely valuable information. They have control over the consignors and consignees of the data. They have controls over commercial data, competitor airlines, subcontractors airlines, or any other mode of transport. But also now they will be competing probably for the same business that freight forwarders and carriers at the moment compete for. Now, this mosaic of new developments is the topic of our discussion today. And we're going to look into the future of the digital supply and transport chains from the point of view of technology, law, and regulation. And I think we couldn't have had better set of people to discuss these issues. All our four speakers are at the forefront of the developments on the digitalization of the transport and supply chain. And they are here to introduce us to the topic, but also to look into the challenges that we face at the moment and what the future holds. Now, for most of people who regularly attend our webinars, probably you are not familiar with them because they don't come from a strictly, let's say, maritime background. So I will make short introductions about them and who they are and what they do. I will start alphabetically. So I will start with Roland van Bokkel, who is joining us from Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Roland joins us in his capacity as the coordinator of the European Federated Project, but in a different capacity that I want to make clear that he's not representing today. Roland is a policy coordinator at the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and the Environment. Now, the Federated Project is arguably the most important project of the European Union on multimodal transport and aims essentially to create a digital platform, a digital infrastructure, which essentially will allow open access to several participants in the multimodal transport chain to exchange data. One aspect of federated is to digitalize customs and to create a common language where European customs will speak with several participants in the transport and supply chain. But most importantly, probably, it looks into getting control on the management of data from the big technological companies, the companies of Google, the companies like Amazon and like Alibaba. And the idea is that the European Union to become the global leader in commercial and industrial data by imposing a different paradigm on how to manage this data. Our second speaker is Lucy England. Lucy is a partner with Fox Williams in London, and she's a rare species in our industry because she's a very accomplished technology lawyer who is actively working in the transport industry. I don't think many solicitors and lawyers in the transport industry can claim that they have a solid technology law background as Lucy. She advises businesses across the transport sector on how to integrate disruptive technologies into their operations and how to manage their risks from these new technologies, legal, regulatory, and operational risks. And because most of her work focuses on the future and focuses on transformational projects, she has been named as the next generation partner from Legal 500. And Lucy will join us with ideas on what the law needs, what do we need to change in the law to make this digitalization happen, if we need to change in it. Our third speaker is Henk Mulder. He joins us from Geneva. Henk is a head of digital cargo of IATA, and he's leading the digital revolution of the aviation cargo industry. Now, the main project of Henk in this concept is the One Record project that has been hailed as a groundbreaking digital project, not only from aviation participants, but for many other industries that they consider it as the golden standard when it comes to digitalizing the transport and supply chain. And just a few words about the project. Henk and his team in IATA trying to move from a peer-to-peer exchange of data to a more inclusive exchange of data, where you have a virtual shipment record that contains all the information about your shipment and where all individual parties relating to the shipment can access, subject, of course, to certain authorizations. And Henk will discuss today what are the challenges that they face, what were the challenges that IATA faced in developing the project, where we are at the moment, and how likely it is that the project will become, that this standard will become the norm, not only for the aviation industry, but for other transport sectors. Last but not least, we have Dan Soffin. Dan, I know him from my early days as a young solicitor. He has been my mentor as a young solicitor in the City of London, and he introduced me to the magical world of air cargo. Now, Dan has always been ranked as one of the world-leading aviation solicitors around the world, and he has a unique expertise well recognized around the world on air cargo operations and on air cargo strategy. Now, Dan has acted for several airlines around the world, for several insurers around the world, but his expertise is not limited just to liability claims. He has provided, and he still provides extensive advice on airlines how to structure the multimodal contracts with road providers, with freight forwarders, with ground handlers, and other service providers of the airline industry. And having a more than 30 or almost 30 years long career in air cargo, has seen almost everything, has seen the transformation of the industry from point to point, has seen the integration of e-commerce, has also now witnessing the integration of new technologies and digitalization in the air cargo industry, and also is seeing how the new players in the transport industry, like the Amazons of this world, are changing the landscape. And he will be discussing today from New York, where he's based, that how the digitalization changes also who participates in this multimodal industry, what kind of new players are coming in, and what are the impact of these developments on the unimodal liability conventions. Now, enough from me. You've had enough from me. The last few things I want to say, a few housekeeping issues. Each one of the panelists will make a presentation of 5-10 minutes, and then we're going to have a discussion on several topics related to technology and law. We're gonna reserve some time at the end for questions from the audience. And if you have any questions that you want to type, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat box. And without further ado, I open the floor to Dan to give us his view, his general view on the topic. Thank you.
George, thanks very much. Lovely introductions. And just a quick point for the audience. Henk gave an excellent brief presentation yesterday in IATA's industry update, which I would recommend everybody look at on the YouTube station. All you have to do is Google IATA industry cargo update on YouTube, and you can see it. His colleagues also discussed digitalization and border controls for cargo. So there's a little synopsis of multimodal initiatives ready for you after this program. I've just got a couple of introductory points to offer a bit of a framework and perspective for our discussion. In order to understand or evaluate today's and tomorrow's multimodal trends, we need to think in terms of both logistics and governance. And I think it helps to recall a bit of yesterday's unimodal world. Marine, road, rail, and air cargo transport and their laws and regulations all developed essentially independently of each other at different times in history over centuries. Different infrastructures, different commercial relationships, different logistical systems, different transport documentation, different conventions, different concepts of liability and limitation. Now, the overall, the evolution of global commerce and technology, combined with ever-increasing consumer demand, has forced these historically independent modes of carriage and their logistical models to become progressively more integrated in order to compete in a global marketplace. It's intuitively obvious in one sense. Two key examples are that unimodal carriers have increasingly incorporated additional modes of transport within their branded chain of carriage, and they've expanded the scope of carriage into non-traditional sectors, such as first and last mile. Now, as unimodal transport has incorporated more multimodal product offerings, and I'm using the term multimodal in a logistical rather than a legal sense at the moment, its supporting supply chain participants have also evolved with much shape-shifting in appearance and role. Now, the end result is that today's global supply chain has really grown beyond its unimodal components and is now effectively and logistically in operations, regardless of any single participating unimodal carrier or unimodal convention or regulation. We're all multimodal these days. The second key point to bear in mind is that supply chain modeling and logistics have become intensely competitive, especially between, for example, the digitally structured Amazons and Alibabas of the world, as George mentioned in his introduction, on the one hand, and individual modal transporters or supply chain participants, such as the recent Maersk CMA CGM model, on the other hand. The stakes are high, with the prospect that the winner, to the extent there's going to be a winner, will potentially control vast components of the global supply chain. And we can't avoid considering whether the Amazons of the world will eventually control or even own any mode of transport that's involved in its own operations. They've already added fast-growing aircraft fleet to their road transport capabilities, with more aircraft on order, investment in several already long-established cargo airlines, and they're on the verge of complete third-party logistics operations. At the moment, as I just learned yesterday, the top 3 digital e-commerce enterprises amount to 50 to 60% of the current marketplace. So in addition to all of this, we have to consider how individual transport modes will compete effectively with, or at least be able to control the terms on which the Amazons have access to or maybe even need their transport fleets and logistical infrastructures. We've recently seen FedEx decline to renew transport contracts with Amazon, just as we've seen UPS increase its commitment with Amazon. Now, the general realignment of resources and participants in the global supply chain is equally dramatic. For example, we need to understand whether freight forwarding and the independent forwarder role and market space is going to be subsumed into either model, or whether they'll continue to exist as independent supply chain participants, and if so, in what roles and capacities. We also need to consider how consumer demand and e-commerce is going to drive supply chain delivery modeling. The speed at which consumers have embraced e-commerce has already reshaped delivery systems, and without obsessing on the pandemic, that in itself has immensely hastened development. Whether technology, regulation, and law is going to lead or follow commercial and economic restructuring within the industry is going to be a constant challenge. Certainly, we're going to need to consider how technology will influence and be integrated into modeling, transactions, and their associated supply chain logistics. And my final point is that the relevance of traditional unimodal governance structures and conventions and regulations, information systems, and commercial practices all begin to wane considerably in importance in the face of an evolving global multimodal framework, which has its own next generation commercial, operational, technological, legal, and regulatory structure. Taking the existing, what I would consider to be antiquated unimodal conventions, for example, they focus predominantly on establishing documentary requirements, liability provisions, shipper and consignee and carrier relationships and procedural responsibilities. In a technologically data-driven, transparent, multimodal world with next generation, which is really already this generation, with that kind of commercial practice in e-commerce, much of the subject matter and content of unimodal conventions is going to be unnecessary, and there's going to be an entirely different set of issues that will need to be addressed. Data and technology is already eliminating the need for documents. Even more data and technology is going to exist to definitively identify and explain the events that trigger liability. Commercial practice, including contracting and sale of goods, will also be electronically driven. Access to data is going to be governed by effective coding and permissions that define and even police the structure of relationships within the chain of carriage. And legal and regulatory development is going to have to incorporate a multimodal focus. So against that introduction, I hand it over to you, George.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for setting the scene. And now I will pass to Roland to tell us, why is the European Union so interested in transport-related data, and what are the bigger implications for the transport system? Roland, the floor is yours.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Just to answer your question quite boldly, why is the European Union or Commission so very interested in transport-related data? That is because actually Europe has a main focus on getting its own affairs in order, getting its basis on order, getting its economy on order. And that means that in a world where most of the data have been given away to platforms who are originated from the United States or China. So 80% of a lot of consumer data related to the European market are more or less in foreign hands. We don't want that to be also the case for industrial data. And industrial data and transport go very much hand in hand. So it's a practical example of saying that within a European context, and as globalization is now turning into a kind of power game between different blocks. European Commission is of the opinion, or Europe, or even all the member states, might also include the United Kingdom one way or another. But anyway, that means that everybody wants to take control of its own data. And that means control of the data, and that might not only be that a nation or Europe is sovereign on its data, it means that the citizens and the industries who are developing the economy of the different countries have a data sovereignty, and that the accessibility of data is developed based on Western values. And these Western values, which we think are Western Europe or European values, and I consider United Kingdom also as a Western value, we relate that not so much as state interventionist or a monopolist, but the ability to allow everybody freedom of choice, have a justice system which allows also equality between the people. And that is actually one of the most important features within the European context, and also within the European member states, of saying we want to get control of our data. And that is actually the baseline of the story I'm going to tell. First, in the conceptual point of view, and as we're talking a bit with a lot of lawyers, I once studied law myself, which was at Rotterdam Law School, which is not considered to be the best, but okay. Then I went to Leiden, that has remarkable attendance. But then I returned back to Rotterdam, and there we developed this kind of Rotterdam rules. And 2 days ago, we had a preparatory meeting to this event, and we are very proud in Rotterdam to have the Rotterdam laws, which is about liability in the multimodal chain. So no unimodal perspective anymore. And you told me it's dead. Okay, well, that's a bad luck. So no multimodal treaty relating that, but let's replace it by data. But conceptually wise, I think everybody, based on the data economy, is now very much aware of the fact that we are all interconnected, that we are very mindful on what we can be doing, that we are fully entering into, which can be called even in Zen Buddhist perspective, entering into the inconceivable. We are all connected, don't know how to do it, but we need the traceability to find a clue how to connect. This is the beauty of the area we are. This is the horrible thing lawyers had to get their hands on because they want to be in control. And that is a bit of a difficulty now in the discussion. It's inconceivable. It's all interconnected, but who is to blame? And just to start with the end of my presentation, I think in this area we're dealing with, the emergent legal question that is appearing is, will the platforms, will the machines, will the technology constitute in future the multimodal transport contracts, or are the individual contracts in the physical world, including the liability clauses, constitute the Tomorrowland of multimodal transport? And in my view, one of the basic concepts that we have to take on board is the paradigm shift we are entering from paper to data, which reads as follows: if all data, all events, all elements, and Henk will further go into it, if they are connected through data and are assembled in a kind of federated infrastructure, which relates to the opportunity that everybody, all transport modes, all logistic operators can trace one another by an audit trail, etc., all paper can disappear, and no lawyers don't need any longer to develop contracts, because these contracts can be generated from the data via smart contracts, or they can be determined on the basis of data liability. So anyway, data will replace physical appearances. Now, I'm not going to further dig into that. My roots are in Rotterdam. My roots are in the maritime, because I represent, of course, the biggest port in Europe. I have been participating in the maritime single window perspective. So we have developed a kind of digital approach and customs approach on how to digitalize our supply chain features. And what appeared to me as the most striking issue is that we wanted to translate this maritime data into connectivity, which was based on message structures. We want to translate that to the total supply chain, and then to the multimodal transport chain. And one way or another, that didn't get to be effective. And therefore, more or less within the context of the Dutch administration, we started to develop a new strategy. And the strategy was related to the digital transport strategy in freight transport, whereas we said, we want to have multimodal. We want to have multimodal transport, which is good for the greening and which is a high political profile. We want to have a seamless multiple transport chain, but it is hampered. There are bottlenecks. There are three major bottlenecks. There's no common language. We don't need an Esperanto, but there is no common language, and we need to understand one another. There's a fragmented legislation. Everybody has its own way bills. The Germans don't accept the Dutch way bills, and the other way around. That has to be done cross-bordering. And then already I identified it, there's no level playing field. We are taken over by other countries or other continents. And that is something which is very much a friction to what we want. We are losing our freedom in the data area if we don't get a level playing field. That's distorting our way of life. And based on the concept, we start developing how to get to new legislation for paperless transport, and how, and that was one of the basic issues also relating to the European Commission, how are we going to develop data sharing as a commodity based on the concept that you need to access data not in a centralized way, because then someone or somebody or whatever, an institution is in charge and it gives liability. No, everybody has its own sovereignty of the data. And that is the basis of the concept of the federated project, where we said, let's try to develop an infrastructure of provision which allows all the platforms to coexist, but they can coexist under the condition that they are interconnectable, interoperable. And in order to allow this interoperability, we have identified, and this is the European interoperability framework, and that's quite important. Interoperability relates to four issues. It's semantics, it's technology, it's organizations, and it is legal issues. How to get interoperability in legal issues? Well, that is more or less your issue. I have already identified my point of view on how to get there. But within the concept of the federated project, we are now developing, apart from the semantics, we are developing the main features which allows everybody within the economy of Europe, which relates to the logistics, can access other parties, can access data of other parties by keeping the sovereignty of their own data and saying what are the conditions based on which the platforms can access data with one another, or where companies can access data by not being dominated, that if you are accessing data channeled through one platform, you cannot do business with another platform. So we are developing and emerging in a way that we are developing an overarching governance to all the platforms that are at the moment existing, which might mean in the end that we are going to define the different constituting elements. All different platforms that are operating within Europe should have on board in order to allow the liberty and accessibility of all the different parties involved. And that will also relate to the fact that for the governments, public administrations, based on legal provisions, you need a legal provision in order to allow governance to enter the different data sources within the different platforms. Now, this is more or less the idea. We are developing this perspective, and based on this development, we say we have now the technology and the elements of coding and the elements of building, we have more or less established. Based on that perspective, you could possibly say code is law. the way we develop the technology is based on the legal principles of liberty and equality and justice. And in the end, it might be the case that the development of this infrastructure provision will also dominate the way lawyers will act in future. Well, that's probably a nice thing to pass over to Henk, whereby the looking glass we are entering into is if the importance of the physical image of multiple transport, will that be replaced by a digital twin that will possibly require additional legal provisions? And maybe you can take the ball there, Henk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you. We will raise several important issues, and we're going to come back to them. But now, you mentioned private platforms, and now let's move to Henk, who in IATA they are in charge of building probably the most successful so far private platform in the transport world, and let's hear his views.
Thank you very much, George, and thank you, Roland, for that question. My first reaction is, it's worse than that. But hopefully by the time I'm finished, you will see why I say that. Yes, so I work on air transport. Mostly I work for IATA, the International Air Transport Association. In that capacity, we coordinate standards and activities for the entire airline sector. It's one of the few modes that has such a representation and such an effectiveness, which is nothing to be proud of. It's just something that happened over time. Probably because airlines are relatively fast, and therefore the only way to work as an industry was to digitalize. This is one of the reasons why I think there's a bit of a head start, but let's not start there now. I would sort of try and paint the picture of what that Tomorrowland actually looks like from a digital logistics and transport perspective. And we can just start where we are today in trends that we all recognize. As Dan mentioned, e-commerce is a very fast-growing trend. We're all used to it. The pandemic has made us reliant on that. And today, 20% of all air freight is e-commerce. That's a huge number. I mean, only a few years ago, it was just a few percentage points. Now it's 20%. It gives an indication of how air freight has to adapt to that electronic mode of commerce. The second trend that we're all aware of is the digitalization of society as a whole. The very fact that we're doing a webinar via computer screens is evidence of that. The fact that we work from home and can work from home proves to us that our society and economy is already digitalized to a very high degree. And then to cap it and to really turn the corner on digitalization, corner as in the bit where things become exponential, is the pandemic. The pandemic in air freight, but not just air freight, has caused significant capacity constraints on the trade lanes. The impact of that is that all of a sudden air transport becomes a high value product. And we have a high value product, you have to treat it like a high value product in terms of quality and efficiency. And all of a sudden digitalization becomes a really important thing to do. And so we're seeing this importance of digitalization rise. The next thing that we can see is that, okay, now we need to optimize our transport lanes because now we have capacity constrained environment. And actually, I intended a economic analysis yesterday, and Dan was referring to that as well. The capacity won't come back very quickly, even after the pandemic. There are some permanent structural changes that have taken place in the transport sector. And so now we have to optimize our transport lanes, which means in many ways multimodal. Already every freight is multimodal. There's no freight that starts at an airplane and ends at an airplane. It always has to go somewhere else, probably on a truck, maybe on a ship or something. So already every freight is multimodal. The next thing that we need in order to optimize any trade lanes in any of these transport modes that are available is significant improvement in visibility and transparency, so that we can actually plan more effectively, make better use of the available infrastructure and capacity, but also to execute it more efficiently and to be aware when there are problems how to deal with that. Then when you start sort of thinking that through is, okay, now we're digitalizing, we have an environment where data is available. This is going to put a lot of pressure on business models. And it's something that Dan referred to earlier, how 20 years ago things were different. Well, I can assure you that 10 years from now, things will be very different as well. So we introduce new business models and possibly new intermediaries. It begs the question, what happens to the old business models and old intermediaries? And in some cases, they may be endangered species, unless, of course, they morph into something that is more adapted to the environment we're actually currently in. We take all of this together, everything I've said so far, it has data written all over it. It is all about data as we go forward. Understanding available capacity, understanding the available infrastructure, understanding the operational status of these infrastructures and these transport modes and these transport companies. Understanding and anticipating and perhaps dealing with incidents, Suez Canal, COVID. What do you do when this happens? How do you deal with the impact of that? You need data to be able to actually make those decisions. And once you have that data, you can then ask yourself, okay, can we look forward? Can we predict what's going to happen? Can we predict how certain, for example, sports events or global elections or whatever it is that is happening in the world, how is this impacting the consumer behavior? And therefore, where's the freight going to be? Where do we need it? If you take that one step further, you end up with the digital twins that Roland was referring to. In other words, a digital representation of the entire transport chain, of all elements within that, the transport vehicles themselves, whether they are airplanes or ships or whatever they are, trucks, roads, infrastructure, you name it. When you take that to the next logical step, is that where's the value? There comes a point where the digital twins become more valuable than the actual underlying asset. Knowing about something could be more important and more valuable than the actual something that you're talking about. And now I get to the answer to Roland's question is, where does this lead to? And as I said, I think it's worse than just digital twins. It's the world of data space. Now, data space, the closest I can give you an image of is what you saw in the film Matrix, right? All these numbers falling down the screen. That is data space. It's the world where you're no longer interacting with real things, but with copies of real things or imagined real things of whatever it is you can imagine. Already, sadly and unfortunately, we're sitting in front of the screen. I have no idea if you guys really exist. Maybe you are, maybe you're models, maybe you're whatever you are, AI things. We'll find out hopefully at some point. But the reality is that is where we're going. And so in that data space, and that's not just a sort of fictional story that you see in the Matrix, this is what we're building. There are institutes, there's one in Germany, Fraunhofer, that does nothing else but how to build such a data space. We're already in it to some extent. For that to function in a digital transport and logistics environment, it means that companies must be able to interoperate at a physical level. In other words, I must be able to receive your freight and move it on and give it to someone else, but also on a digital level. We must be able to plug our systems into one another as easily as we're plugging in a USB cable into a USB port on our laptop, and it works. That's the whole concept. Right now, that's not the case. It wouldn't work if you tried it in freight, but that's where we're going. We'll need the equivalent of search engines. Okay, I need to ship some freight. Well, who can do that? What's the status? Is there a problem? What happens in Suez? I want real answers. I don't want to have to browse the news for that. I need the data for that. We will see new digital intermediaries in the data space. And when it comes to it, and this comes back to a point made by Roland as well, in the end, it's all about the data that we have and the data that we share. Who owns that data? Where is that data? What are the rights and obligations? It's that data space that we're heading towards, and that is not 100 years away. I think it's about 10 years away, and the 10 years in freight means yesterday, because typically it takes 20, 30 years for anything to change. So in other words, we're already there. I'll say just a few words on what we have done at IATA to actually prepare us for that. And the first thing I'll say is that we've started with a dreadful and terrible legacy, two of them, in fact. Paper is one, and EDI is the other. Paper, I don't have to explain it. We've all grown up with it. It's lovely stuff, but you don't want to see it on your desk anymore, right? It's not very handy. But EDI is almost just as bad. Okay, it may not pollute your desk, but the concept of documents is completely wrong when it comes to data. Data is in documents, but how do you get it out of these documents? You can't. You can scan a piece of paper, but good luck getting the data in there. Finding an invoice, what is the date, what's the amount, what's it for? You're not going to manage. So EDI is actually, it's a problem we're dealing with. The other issue that we have, or that we are facing in the air transport industry, and I work with other modes as well. You mentioned maritime. I have a lot of contact in the maritime world. And I think we're all sharing the same issue, is that a lot of companies are at different stages of digital maturity. Some are at the paper stage, quite literally. They're still using typewriters, would you believe, or screens with printers, but that's the same thing really. Whereas other companies, they already know how to deal with paper, with electronic documents, and so they start developing electronic business processes. Those that have that and master that, they can start looking at digital systems and digital business. And from there on, you sort of go to the whole data space story that I mentioned earlier on. In the end, for this to work, you need to work at all of these levels. You have to work with all the stakeholders at their stage of maturity and trying to bring them along so that when in 10 years we live in that data space, we will still survive as a business, as an industry, but also as an economy. For it to work, we identified that you need a few things. The first thing is standards. It's part of what we do at IISTL, so it's natural that we say that's what you need. But I do believe you need it. So we have standards for APIs, which is sort of the basic entry points to get into data space, to get into digital business. The second one is the one that Roland mentioned, is around semantics. We must at least understand each other. We don't have to speak the same language. Excuse me, there's only a few of us here that are the same nationality, and they're not the Brits. Myself and Roland, I think, are Dutch, and the rest of you from different countries, and yet we are able to communicate via English. So we understand the semantics, even though we don't necessarily master the language perfectly. Semantics is extremely important, both for the digital business perspective, but also for the legal perspective. We must make sure we understand the meaning of the terms, even if we use different terms. And then lastly, from our perspective, security. Data security is absolutely key. In the old world with paper, it's easy. You just put it in an envelope, you make sure that you can trust the postman, or you FedEx it, or whatever you want to do, and you've got a good chance that your data is protected. When you use EDI, point-to-point messaging, you got a good chance too, as long as you trust the parties involved. When it comes to data sharing, the minute you share data, no matter how much security you put on, literally every person on the planet that has a computer can theoretically access it. Okay, so security becomes a key thing. And then the fourth one, that's not on our list, but actually really is something that we're talking about here, is the legal interoperability that Roland also referred to. The last 2 points I'll make is that none of this can work without cooperation. When you're talking about how do we deal with the mega corps like Amazon and others that are shaping this industry or trying to shape the industry for their own purposes, the only answer to that is cooperation, but all the other parties that are involved, which is something that is going on and happening. And it's, of course, why we're here. And the last thing then for any of this to work is prioritization. Pre-COVID, digitalization was important, but not that important. In many cases now, it's becoming a lifeline for business. If you don't get the data, if you don't get the information, you're not in business. So with that, I will hand back to George. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henk, for this insightful, non-technological presentation. Even I could understand. I have no clue, apart from putting the video on at the beginning of the webinar. But now I think everything directs us to Lucy. Roland, Henk, and Dan raised the legal issue. And again, Lucy, I am, as you know already, I'm not data prolific in terms of my knowledge about data. Even before meeting you, I thought it's my data. I own the data. It's my information. But you told me that that's not exactly true. So please let us know, what is the situation with data and the law at the moment?
Thank you, George, and hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Yes, I feel like the pressure's on now. Everything points to this fourth arm, the interoperability, the legal issues with it. Well, yeah, it is a minefield, or it can be when you first try and look at it, I think. And I think the way to look at it is to break it down. I think when you're looking at multimodal transport, you're talking about data sharing across different platforms. So what are the legal issues with data sharing? That I think is the crux of what we're looking at it from a legal point of view. And to break it down even further, I think it helps to think about where you are in your data stage, and to which questions you need to ask as a lawyer. Are you at the beginning of that data journey, if you like, trying to get hold of the data, the access to that data? Can you get hold of it? That's the first part. The second part, if you like, is once you have the data, how can you use it? What are your management, handling processes, processing rights and obligations? And then the third part is disclosing that data, whether it's disposing of it, getting rid of it, or the ability to onward share with somebody else. What are the legal issues in each of those three buckets? And I think the way I look at it, and what I'm just going to speak to for a few minutes, are the list of questions, and it is a list of questions. I'm not going to give you any answers because I don't think there are any necessarily, or certainly no single answers. But as a lawyer, what are the questions you need to be asking? I'm English qualified, and so I'm looking at it more from an English law point of view, but a lot of these points are commercial, so will cross boundaries. It doesn't matter where in the world you are. So taking the first bucket, which is getting hold of the data in the first place, I think for me, the first and one question which infiltrates everything is, what data are we talking about? Everybody assumes you're talking about personal data often, but that's not always the case. You obviously have personal data, but then there's a lot of non-personal data, and in multimodal transport, you might be talking more about non-personal data. But there is a chance, a risk, that what you classify as operational non-personal data could be personal data. GDPR has a lot of arms and legs, and if you can identify an individual from a piece of data, then it might be personal data. So you know that a truck is moving at 50 miles an hour. If you also know the timetable of the staff at that given time, you can identify which driver was driving at 50 miles an hour. That potentially becomes personal data. So you have to distinguish what data it is you're talking about. If you are talking about just pure commercial data, then I think that, you know, that's a commercial asset of a business and can be dealt with separately. The other question about what data you're talking about is whether you're looking at what I call raw data, or data that's had something done to it. So the raw data is what Henk described as the matrix of the ones and the zeros on a wall. You know, those individual ones and zeros, or the 50 miles an hour, don't mean very much, or certainly don't have much value attached to it. But it's when you collect that data and analyze it or organize it with other pieces of data, that's when it becomes more meaningful, and you're upgrading that data to information. And it's information that might have more rights and legal rights attached to it. So they're the first couple of questions. And then George, just as you alluded to, everybody talks about data ownership. There is certainly in the English legal system no concept of being able to own a piece of data. Data itself, separate to perhaps the hardware that it sits on, doesn't have its own legal category. It's not identified as having any proprietary rights by the English courts. So that's one thing to, I think the language that is often used about data ownership is used at a very relationship level between parties in the system, but it's not necessarily about ownership. It's about control, and that's where often if you like, the power comes from, and I'll come on to that. So generally there's no ownership of data, but you have to question who has control of it. You are then looking at, if you are the generator of the data, if you don't own it, what can you do to protect it, if you can do such a thing? And this is where I think the law is limited and could be ripe for some change. It's quite hard to establish legal rights in data, but there are three main areas to consider. One is whether it's confidential information. Data may well be confidential, and there may be common law obligations of confidentiality attached to it, as well as contractual obligations of confidentiality. But that doesn't apply to every single piece of data. Not everything is confidential. There's a possibility that some data or databases attract copyright, which you might be able to qualify for, but for that to be the case, data needs to be original. And it's quite hard to establish perhaps that there is originality in data. And then the third one is this EU concept of database rights. So if you have a data set that's been put into a database. It's structured data. Unstructured data generally has less value and no rights. But if you have structured data in a particular way, you may attract a database right. But you need, the test for that is whether there's a substantial investment in presenting the contents or obtaining the data. So again, it's not an easy box to tick to get that level of protection. So all of that generally comes to, there's not much in law that can protect data per se, and contracts are pretty crucial in making sure you get any protection if that is what you want. So that's looking at it from a generating data point of view. But if you're on the other side and you want access to the data, you have to ask the questions about whether you have the right to access it. Where is it coming from? Who is disclosing it? Is it what's called open data? There is a lot of open data out in the market, but there are license terms attached to open data. So you have to make sure you comply with those license terms. There is, certainly in transport, there are legal obligations to disclose that data to public authorities. So the public authority may have the right to have it through legislation, but business to business rather than business to authority, there is less obligation to ask for that data. It's a commercial discussion. You also all of this comes down to, again, the contract. What is in the contract between one party and another? And it may vary depending on where you get the data from. So then lastly, in this bucket of accessing the data, there's a question of competition issues. Are there competition issues? If you own a huge amounts of data, your competition law forbids abuse of dominance of that data. Are you distorting the market possibly by not sharing that data? Just because a company has a large amount of data does not automatically mean it has a dominant position. I think there are potentially competition issues with data sharing, but they are perhaps not less important, but it's harder for it to become a competition issue. But it does depend on the factors with the data sharing platform that you're talking about. Do competitors have access to the data in a different way? Can other data be substituted for the data that the dominant player has? Can the company analyze and monetize that data? There are issues that have to be tested to know whether there's a dominance issue, but there isn't automatically a dominance issue because one company has all the data. So that's the sort of bucket of access and use and how I look at it. Just moving into the next phase of sort of, if you have hold of the data, what does that mean from a legal perspective? Well, again, if it's personal data, we all know and love GDPR, and there is, you have to comply. Do you have consent to use it? Do you have a legitimate business interest in using it? Everybody assumes you need consent, but there are an individual's consent, but there are other ways to use data without consent. But that's a question to ask. Do you have the right to use the data for what you want to use it for? And that will come down to your terms of access. So back to the first bunch of questions. If you want to modify or reverse engineer or analyze that data, do your contractual terms allow you to do that? That is a question of contract rather than law. There's then the question of, do you have any warranties, or is the data given with any qualifications? What if the quality of the data is not accurate? What if you're not given it in a timely way, for example? What are your remedies, repercussions against the person who has given you the data? Well, again, it comes down to contract. There is nothing at law that says that data has to be given in it has to be valid and appropriate. There's obviously criminal side of things, but that's not what we're talking about really here. So do you have service levels, availability service levels with the person who is the company that is giving you the data? do you have one thing when you talk about digitalization and data, artificial intelligence always comes up. I think the one thing with AI systems that you have to be careful about, and does perhaps change, it doesn't change liability positions, but it changes how you have to think about liability. If you have the data going into an AI system, you have to be very careful to understand who's providing the data and who is training the data. So if that data is trained by the customer, the supplier should not have any liability because it's not done any of the training. That's again a question of contract. There's nothing in law that says what's right or wrong in that arena. Then still more questions. What if you do something, if you derive more data from the data that you have? What rights do you have in that derived data over the original data that you have? That again is a question of contract. There is nothing again in law that says or IP rights if there are IP rights in it, but that's a big question that a lot of organisations have. What can I analyse it? That's what I actually want to do with it, and can you reuse it for a different purpose for which you took it in the first place? Again, there's no answer, straight answer anyway. It depends on the terms on which you have that data and where you got it from. So then just to finish, the sort of the end picture, if you like, of disposing of data, the message which I keep saying is it all comes down to contract, really. And, what do your terms say about what you have to do with that data at the end of it? Do you have a right to pass it on to somebody else? Do you have a right to give it to another customer if you've got it from one customer? Do you have a right to pass on the derived data that you have generated to a second customer? That all depends on the terms on which that data comes in the first place. So I think the sort of takeaway messages from all of it is, big question over what is the data that you're talking about in the first place. That points to a lot of the avenues that you have to go down. I think the willingness to share data in data sharing platforms does depend, and this is the two issues that Federated have picked up on. What will that data be reused for, and what liability is attached to it? People are more willing to share data if there's no comeback on them, if there's no liability, I think. But if somebody is paying you for data or paying you for data analysis, commercially, not legally, but commercially, there should be some liability implications if a service that you've paid for does not provide what you've asked for, so secure data, accurate data. So there's a question of money in there. And then finally, I think it comes back to control. It's not about data ownership, it's about who has control of the data and what they are willing to allow to happen with that data. So that is how I, as a lawyer, look at this.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And you have certainly educated us, and certainly me. There's no doubt about it. It's a complicated field, and I suppose that's why we're here, because it's a lot to be done in the future. Or changes will come in the future inevitably. I will come back with my first question to you in a few minutes with some of the issues you raised. I think we'll have another 25 minutes. I will try and ask one question to each of you, one or two questions each of you. And then we have already two questions from the audience that I will try to pass on at the very end. Now, my first question will be to Dan. Now, I know we have a few freight forwarders in the audience, and Henk and Roland mentioned intermediaries, digital intermediaries or physical intermediaries. And from my understanding, Dan, I think with the new digitalization, the role of the freight forwarder is changing. But even without the digitalization, the role of the freight forwarder had changed since the 1950s, 60s, when it was introduced as an intermediary between consignors and carriers. What do you see as the new role, the role of the freight forwarder in the 21st century, digital or otherwise? Do you see a more a new role? Do you see an expansive role, a diminishing role? Do you think Amazon will play a role there to affect the ambit and scope of operations of freight forwarders?
Well, you're describing something that I'm seeing as a pinball machine here, with the forwarder being the ball and a lot of bumpers around. And by the way, Hank raised the question as to whether we were actually here in real person or otherwise. We are not holograms. We're definitely here today. The story of the forwarder is very interesting and instructive, because amongst all the supply chain participants, their roles have perhaps changed the most over time, and they've shown so much resilience and initiative. I think it's fairly well accepted that in their initial roles as cargo agents, they pioneered the concept of consolidation and worked very hard to secure an alter ego status as, you know, what we would call a consolidator or forwarder. Have worked diligently over the years to preserve roles as agents and forwarders. And regardless of any questions about the capacities in which they act, it's undeniable, I think, that they've generally succeeded in the most critical area of client management and customer relations, which, despite any gripes from the airlines over reduced customer contacts, they've really allowed airlines to focus on what they do best, which is flying metal, while forwarders bear the brunt of the developing and perfecting direct shipper and consignee relationships. Now, given that time in the air is often the shortest time in the whole transport chain, forwarders have also established critical infrastructure and handling know-how that facilitates the most efficient movement of cargo during the rest of the journey. And by the way, on which airlines heavily rely, you know, whether it's shipper-built units for safety and conformity, whether it's documentation to make sure that border crossings go unimpeded. In my view, on the emerging battlefield, and it is a battlefield between the Amazons, between the FedExes, and between legacy airline transporters, and that's where I see the pinball game. The key question is going to be, where do forwarders, as this crown jewel of global transport and handling know-how, with their customer lists and with their well-established consolidating infrastructure, is Amazon going to secure forwarder loyalty, or will they build their own customer networks and contacts, as they're already doing, and try to operate without forwarder support? There's no question that digital capability is going to make it easier to build direct, at least electronic relationships, and third-party logistics. So there is certain to be intense competition on the battlefield for clients. But forwarders are also moving very quickly and successfully to digitalize and change their modus operandi. I don't see the same potential client threat issue with airlines, who should really be finding it easier and easier to ensure that forwarders remain key links in their own supply chains, if only to assure constant volume and load, or dependable volume and load. I appreciate that there are what I would call teething issues between the respective industry associations in terms of how these two essential players work together. But the bottom line is that forwarders and carriers are so essential as symbiotic teammates, it's really inconceivable that they won't find a common ground and productive working ground, particularly to the extent that airlines want to compete successfully against Amazon or the FedEx integrator models. I mean, I think in that sense, forwarders are undeniably indispensable.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. Now, I have a question for Roland. Roland, you mentioned China, you mentioned the US, you mentioned Amazon. Now, to an extent, I mean, it's a two-pronged question. The first one is, from my understanding as a neutral observer, for a digital platform and a digital supply chain to operate, you need to have it on a global basis, or the more parties they subscribe to it and the more countries are that follow the same example, the easier the communication becomes. So my first question is, how do you see your relationship with countries like China, US, and how do you envisage them buying into your project? And the second one is, how do you see your relationship with Amazon and the Amazons of those world? I mean, they are here to stay based on commercial capabilities and growth. And to an extent, you are trying to play their role now as a neutral intermediary. How do you see your relationship developing with them, both from a state point of view and from a commercial point of view with Amazons and the Alibabas of this world?
Thank you, George. Well, just to start out, I'm not representing the European Commission here. I'm only doing a project partly financed by the European Commission in order to show them, to showcase also in different countries. Also, Henk is doing something on the Internet of Logistics by showing them how you can do based on some principles, which is meaning accessibility for all, neutral, open, data sovereignty, pool-based mechanisms. So we have identified some operating framework elements. And these elements constitute the way the European community, the European member states would like to progress in this platform economy. That's not going to say that we are going to expropriate all the data that are available in the Uber, Amazon, or whatever platforms. No, the end will be that we are, as I foresee what might be happening. We have this data space policy. Within the data space policy, we in Europe foster the opportunity of data sharing infrastructures which allow easy access, safe access for all. That means we are going to set the requirements based on which the big platforms can operate. That has partly to do with federated. What it also has to do is with the total European high-profile policy issues of the data space policy and the single market, digital single market policies. We have a data governing act, Data Protection Act, which was already mentioned by Lucy. So we are setting in place increasing amount of pieces of legislation which prohibits the big platforms from easy accessibility, easy misuse of data, also for their commercial gains, so to say. So that you have to see it as we are going to put legislation in place that limits the unlimited scope yet of the platforms. The other way, the federated platform issue relates to the fact that we don't want these big platforms to take over. Then they dominate all the transporters. They are going to have a cheap buy-in from all the transporter in order to make use of the Amazon or whatever kind of platforms. Then as soon as they have captured 80% of the multimodal transport chain, they're going to increase their entry fees, so to say. And then we have a total disruption of the market. So it's a kind of protective wall that we are putting behind these big platforms, which are unlimited as yet, in reframing it and saying, listen guys, this is too much. We're going to water you down. That is the principle, and we're building now on how to do it in such a way that we can coexist with these guys by not allowing them too much power. That's more or less the baseline.
Thank you, Roland. Very clear and loud, I think, is the message.
Yep.
Now, moving to Henk. Henk, I mean, the One Record project is the most, let's say, developed among the modes of transport. How do you see its future? First of all, are other participants in the aviation supply chain buying into it, willing to participate? And how do you see your project influencing other modes of transport, especially the road segments, which you have a very symbiotic relationship, as Dan said, but also the maritime sector, which is a bit more conservative when it comes to digitalization of services?
Let me address a few of those points. perhaps to sketch an analogy that I think will actually answer all your questions almost in seconds. One record is essentially a technological specification that allows companies to exchange data over the internet. And we refer to this as the Internet of Logistics. And that is not a sort of simile for saying, okay, companies interact as if it's an internet. No, we're talking about the internet, where companies exchange data via the internet in order to operate their business, in order to work together with their customers, with their suppliers and everything. And then if you take this back 30 years to when the actual World Wide Web was created by Tim Berners-Lee, it took about 10 years for the world to figure out what to do with that. And so our entire economy today is based on that. So we asked that question is, you know, how do companies respond to it? How do other modes respond to it? The answer is, how did the world respond to the internet? And then we know the answer to that. It changed everything. And so the vision behind this is not to create some sort of unique a program that puts airlines at some competitive advantage over the other modes. On the contrary, the objective is to open up the flow of data within the airline sector, of course, because this is where it's originating, but also in any other sector. And so we do cooperate, for example, with the maritime world. We have close relationships with the Digital Cargo, the Digital Container Shipping Association, with whom we have strategic discussions on how did you do that? How did you create an IAWA bill? What was the problem in the implementation? Why did it take so long? These questions we discuss for the simple reason that it's in everybody's interest that all the modes of transport can make that transition. And the reason why that is goes back to the very first question you asked to Dan. It goes back to the forwarder, because ultimately the forwarder is the customer of all of these transport modes. If the forwarder can work efficiently and effectively, all transport modes benefit. If they cannot, then none of us benefit. They are the intermediary today, and I suspect they will be tomorrow. They may change name, we'll see about that. But the point is that these standards have to work across modes for them to be really effective. And in that sense, it really, I come back to the internet, anything we can do to facilitate the access and flow of data, the simplification of getting systems to talk to each other, the interoperability we referred to before, all of that is behind that very simple word, internet. It really is all it is.
Thank you, Henk. So it's more cooperative rather than, you change even the paradigm to be a more cooperative paradigm rather than a competitive paradigm when it comes to data sharing, to build trust among the parties involved so that they can and are willing to share via the digital infrastructure.
Correct. And it's that cooperation that introduces new efficiencies, and it's these new efficiencies that will move things forward, that will change the business models, that will change the effectiveness. So in that sense, yes, it's about cooperation, but it's really about unleashing innovation on the industry, which it desperately needs.
Thank you, Henk. Thank you.
Just to add, George.
Yeah, go ahead.
It is about cooperation in the development of the infrastructure provision. There we have to cooperate and be closely connected. The competition is in the services based on the infrastructure provision. And there is the big difference, because that allows to the emergence of new innovative services. And like what Dan and Henk mentioned relating to the role of the forwarder, that is a service provider, which is the baseline of their work, solving problems. And this is the great opportunity for the platform economy, for the forwarder: solve your problems, develop new services. The only problem for the transporters is that the forwarder might take over being a platform originator, because they are going to provide for the service instead of the transporters. And there is a threat to the transporters themselves, but that's probably another chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you. Now, before we go to, we have 3 questions from the audience, but I want to ask one question to Lucy before we go to the history, because we have another 10 minutes. Lucy, inevitably, Brexit is still an issue. I know Roland wants the UK to be part of the European vision in terms of data sharing. Is it going to be, you think? Is the UK going to abide to the rules of the Data Governance Act and create neutral data intermediaries, or you think we're going to go a different way, more closer to the American way of regulating intermediaries in terms of data?
I think we will go whichever way gives us a competitive edge. I'm not sure which way that will be yet. That was the idea of Brexit, wasn't it? I think there is a, dare I say, this is my own personal view, a danger that the amount of legislation coming out of the EU across data is so confusing to businesses that if we, the UK, have an option to try and simplify that in any way, we will do so. I think there is a need to a point to stop the dominance of certain players in the market, but that's economy. I'm no economist, but over the years, the survival of the fittest, people keep growing until somebody says stop, and it might be the law or regulation that tells them to say stop. I think the compliance that's going to come, or the compliance that will come from that will be needed to make sure the Data Governance Act, there's going to be a Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act. This is the first, or not first, there is going to be a stream of legislation like this, which I think as the UK will not want to fall behind in any way. And if in not taking it on board, abiding by it, making it become part of our statute book, if it means we fall behind, we will take it. But I think we have the flexibility now, dare I say, to try and make things more simple if we can.
Thank you, Lucy. And that then opens the floor to one of the questions of the attendees, which is related, and it's primarily addressed to you. Michael has asked from Australia. He's an Australian lawyer. And he has asked that there is a language in use when talking about issues relating to data and associated rights and restrictions. And there is also a need to ensure that we're all speaking more or less the same language globally. He wonders whether there are any moves globally to standardize this legal language about data.
It's a good question. I guess there would be if there is a reason, if there is confusion caused by the language being used. I mean, lawyers will still talk about liabilities. The question is, where will the liability come from? Is it liability arising from data sharing, data security? They're all sort of simple enough terms to understand. But I think within the law, there may have to be a level of commonality of the wording used. Yes, absolutely. As data sharing becomes more global, any national definitions used, terms used, I think will need to be eked out so that there is that global understanding. I'd be interested to know what kind of what Michael's got in mind, actually. So very happy to have a conversation offline about what he's thinking about more particularly.
George,
yes.
Could I say something very quickly? Roland, in his writings, I think has elucidated a very important point, simply even in the title of what he says. Code is law, law is code. And one question that I think we're all going to have to ask each other is, what is the real engine here? Is law going to attempt to step in to sculpt how data and technology move? Or is the sheer power of data and technology going to end up influencing how the law develops? And I don't think there's an answer to that at the moment, but I think it's entirely conceivable that legislators look at a new issue and they decide, well, we've got to do something about it. I don't see why we won't in the future be focusing very much on letting data actually guide how law develops and to the extent that it has a personality, taking the lead role in how law develops.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Lucy. Thank you. Now, because we're pressed for time, I have a question from Chris, which I think is addressed to Henk primarily and then to Roland. That we have promoted the use and exchange of data with the potential for universal platforms. However, we already see a large number of thefts through freight exchange platforms. Such data is invaluable to thieves, smugglers, and terrorists, particularly with containerized multimodal transportation. How does the panel consider that this issue of security can be addressed against the commercial pressures to exchange and access such data? And surely the more access to data, particularly with shared platforms, the greater the risk of loss to goods or other criminal activities.
Let me first put a picture in your head. The next time you're in an airplane, hopefully very soon, you may be sitting on top of $20 million worth of diamonds, 30 centimeters under your seat. You have no idea. If you did, of course, that creates nice opportunities if you're a criminal. I think that's the sort of problem we're dealing with here. The reality is, whether we like it or not, and this is completely independent from freight, logistics, exchanges, transport, is that we're living in a digitalized world already. There are cyber criminals. In fact, it's a very well organized industry that is very beneficial to the participants. The question is, are we ready to protect ourselves against them? And in many industries, that is the case. In the financial industry, which is also using exactly the same type of communication technology, they have protected themselves, both in terms of technology, but also in terms of how they train their staff. I think when it comes to freight, I think that's probably an area where there needs to be more focus on, are you aware where the dangers are? Are you protecting yourself against it? Regardless of whether you use digital systems, you may be able to walk into a warehouse, find a stack of airway bills or bills of lading, have a good look at them, make a copy with your smartphone, walk out and do what you want to do with it. And now we're talking about paper. We're not even talking about digital. So I think it's more about, are the companies ready to protect themselves? The technology is there, the standards are there, absolutely no issue with that. It's really about, is there enough awareness among the participants that are willing to share data on these platforms to protect themselves adequately against cybercrime? In many cases, the answer will be yes. I think certainly most commercial companies are aware of this and have good policies and training and systems against it. It's probably the ones that are dabbling with this that may be taking a risk. But I think that's a developmental issue rather than a potential structural issue. I think we just have to overcome that as an industry.
Thank you, Henk. Thank you. And now I have two more questions. One last question from Denise. I think this is addressed to the lawyers of the panel. And Henk, feel free to jump in. Now, what will be the role of lawyers if data-derived technologies replace contracts and liabilities? Will any conflict, will any disputes even lead to lawsuits and to court hearings? I know Dan has strong views on that. So I will start with Dan responding.
Look, I have this vision that that the next generation is going essentially to be governed by artificial intelligence, and that all of the movies, whether it's Westworld, whether it's 2001: A Space Odyssey, all of these, whether it's Blade Runner, even more, are going to show us that more and more is going to be accomplished through data and technological application, and that it will absolutely reduce what the way in which we consider dispute at the moment. Okay, we as lawyers, we think about who's a plaintiff, who's a defendant, who's a claimant or a defendant, and we're structured on this dispute resolution human platform, so to speak. With all of the data that's going to be in the cloud, the things that are happening on Earth are going to be able to be resolved by that data. And I could go on and on about it, but I won't. I do think the role of lawyers are going to change, and we've said humorously to ourselves for a long time, we do our best jobs when there is no issue for us to resolve. That is where I think lawyers have helped the most.
Thank you, Dan. Lucy, Roland, do you have any views on that? Lucy, I guess you are the new generation lawyer. You are more into technology and data.
Well, yeah, I was just saying, I think every lawyer will become a technology lawyer. There will always be lawsuits. There will always be blame. It will just be how establishing that blame, that fault, where liability lies will change. The analysis that lawyers have to do will change, but there will always be a role of a lawyer. We'll just become more, all of us will become more technology savvy, both in what we use, but also what we understand so that we can advise our clients.
And be able to be philosophers.
That as well.
Roland, any views?
Yeah, I think the only thing I can add is that this is a future which is still quite far away. If I relate to issues like having a paperless or electronic bill of lading, and that we're getting that in a paperless perspective on how to deal with it and how to relate that to blockchain solutions and how to do that in a global maritime world, that everything is being done on data instead of paper, accepted by different authorities in different continents. I think that will take at least 10 years. So we have some time to adjust to a paperless society, and then we're growing into it. It won't be a big problem to grow into it. It will be different from us, old people, but not for you, young people.
I hope you mean me, Roland. I hope you include me into the young people of the generation.
I'm definitely not paperless, I can assure you.
Okay. George, let me inject
Yes,
a comment here, perhaps.
Of course.
I should say I'm not a lawyer, I'm a technologist. What I can tell you from a technology perspective is that you may have no idea what's going on under the hood. What is in these systems, what is in the data is entirely opaque. You hear these cases where it turns out that iPhone has a backdoor for the NSA. Wow, what a surprise. Well, you didn't know that. Well, now we know. But this is the case everywhere. It could be intentional or unintentional, but there's an awful lot of stuff happening under the hood. And therefore, when it comes to that question, I think not only do we need lawyers that are technologists, I actually think we have to code lawyers and let them loose into the systems, and let them be the automatic agents that will actually drive through this and say, hey, I think I found an issue here. And that takes me back to the matrix.
Thank you, Henk. And just as a final comment from me, I remember when I was working with Dan, when I had to do my first electronic discovery on an arbitration case, and it was a huge change for me. And I think the whole team, when we tried to look electronic discovery and disclosure and so on, it was a learning step, but it has become now one of the major ways, at least in city law firms, of dealing with the litigation. And from what you say, it's going to change even more in the future. You will need to get more into coding and to find information that you are not easily revealed. Anyways, it's 2 o'clock. It's 2:05. I think we reached an end. I would like to thank all of you, all 4 of you, for joining us for this wonderful webinar. I think you raised enough issues to have another one. That's not a threat. That's not a threat. It's a, it's just, I think,
It's an invitation.
Yes, evidence of the quality of the issues and the uniqueness of the issues, and how many aspects the data issues raise. And we, at least at the Institute, we will certainly keep on the research, and we will continue the public presentations on related issues. I also would like to thank everyone who joined us. We're more than 100 people at some point. We hope that you get inspiration on data and technology related issues in the transport sector. And I hope we see you now on the 9th of June, where we have a webinar organized by Professor Simon Bond on the lessons learned for the shipping sector by the pandemic. Well, some of these would be related to the more digitalization of services. Now, on that note, thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day, and hopefully see you in person soon. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Hello.